This is a no-nonsense documentary. We will discuss our health issues, right from health education to health delivery, the whole system. If you listen very carefully, you will realize my family and your family's life is actually hanging on a string. Life is a flowing stream that dribbles around boulders searching for that bliss. It always hovers around seeking a colorful, cheerful, and happy life. But there are times we fall sick. We need support. We become dependent. And then
you pay money, get an MBBS degree.
I agree with you. The doctor has not followed the Hippocratical oath.
As a country, we have never paid attention to healthcare.
Healthcare has never been an agenda in this country.
85% of the drugs that are sold in this country, they have never been tested for therapeutic efficacy.
The pharmaceutical industry is no virgin, is no Mother Teresa, and no saint.
Who are our experts in healthcare, who opine all the time on healthcare, who decide even about the future of healthcare in this country? They're either politicians who masquerade as doctors, or doctors who masquerade as politicians, or bureaucrats that masquerade as both, and even worse, businessmen who are neither doctors nor politicians but have the worst aspect of both.
Regulation, by and large in India, has been notoriously subject to, weaknesses, manipulation, rent seeking.
Pathological lab is a business.
Medical council is corrupt, so are the government.
People in the political system are aware of what is happening.
Unfortunately, health has never been an election issue.
Health is a state subject in it.
I don't think politicians are really very serious. We are not serious about health as yet.
Space travel has also been privatized. I don't know how it was relevant to coronavirus. And what did we do for healthcare? Zilch.
really, who cares? I will offer an overview of the healthcare system. It is for you and our families. We face challenges, have been devastated by pandemics and cyclones, but we have endured all of that. Thanks to some extremely dedicated doctors and healthcare workers who, in spite of great risks, have saved our lives. But it is perhaps time for introspection, time to take a hard look at the health system. We might have a good intent, but with a bad execution, does it really matter? The doctor will want some tests done. Then he will prescribe medicines. You and I can perhaps afford that. But what about our poor relatives? There are 3 steps to climb before we get cured. The doctor who we meet, the tests, the medicines, and of course the environment. I cannot reach the depths that ought to be probed into. You can well ask if I am qualified to discuss the medical profession. No, I am not. But having put in nearly 6 decades in the media, I certainly can reach the policymakers and ask questions. Let me begin at the beginning. Post-independence, health and education were neglected. And we are paying a price even today. Why? I will begin with the persons at the helm of power, the bureaucrats.
Having settled down after a few years, it is amazing that considering that Nehru was such a welfareist and he did have a very serious commitment to welfare economics, why he didn't position health and education as primary drivers or central and focus issues for a development dialogue.
In the early years, not only was the size of the problem underestimated, there was also a belief that hospitals and hospital-based care could provide most of the answers.
There's a whole huge connection between health and wealth. And if you're not healthy, you don't produce wealth. It's as simple as that. So there is a connectivity, and that's the reason why most countries, including UK and Europe, which also had a traumatic comeback after the Second World War, did bring focus to health and education because those they saw as investments to the future.
And I think we'll have to recognize the fact that those were big policy lapses of those years.
Unless you have an educated, healthy population, unless our dividend, what we call the demographic dividend, that can only be realized if we have a healthy young youth force which is also educated. That was the experience of China also, which had an equally traumatic post-colonial future. But there again, if you notice, in the 50s and 60s, China did position health and education as very, very focal to development dialogue. That didn't happen.
In 1988, India and China were head-to-head comparable economies. We were same on the scale of international GDP. 30 odd years down the line, when our Prime Minister swings the swing with Xi Jinping, the financial and economic fortunes of the two Asian superpowers had diverged. China has become a 4.5 times larger GDP and economically larger country than India. So India has got to be appreciated, not in a kind of Alice in Wonderland kind of concept, not with the nostalgia of mythology, but being firmly grounded in today's reality, where a 73-year-old nation, born out of colonial depravity, born at a time when the average life expectancy of an Indian was less than 50 years, has struggled to balance a lot of balls. And controlling, what is the big stress on India today? The big stress is India is not only struggling to cope and provide for its people, India is struggling to cope with Pakistan on one hand, China on the other, and whoever, even Nepal is making faces at us. So this completely distorts the allocation of state funding as far as this country, this nation is concerned.
Sri Lanka, which got independence in 1948, just after us, concentrated on primary education and literacy from the very beginning. Sri Lanka's literacy rate today is somewhere near 99%, and this is the result of early investment, public investment in school education and literacy, which is something that was happening in our neighborhood, but which we did not do. We didn't do it in primary education, we didn't do it in primary health.
The problem arose was in the way in which the center state, the distribution of functions and responsibilities happened between center and the states. So if you see the 7th schedule, it's the state government has a responsibility of power, of irrigation, of building infrastructure, as well as health and education. But the money, the collection of taxes and the financial and fiscal powers were with the center.
And finally, the biggest nail in the coffin and the most painful nail in the coffin had been that over the last decade or more than that, the government has lost the desire to run the healthcare.
So what now? Does the solution lay in privatization of healthcare in India?
The trend seems to suggest as if it's more for privatization of healthcare, which I'm a little concerned because I don't believe that health as a sector, unlike steel or unlike tourism or unlike other sectors, that the state should abdicate its responsibility and have more of private for-profit sector incentivized to provide services. That model hasn't worked anywhere. It is practiced most widely in the United States, and it has been found to be wanting even in a country like US, which spends 20% of its GDP on health.
America is America today because they are neighbored by Mexico down in the south and Canada up in the north. America does equip its army but does not go on playing war games every 15 minutes. How did Japan evolve? How did South Korea evolve? Because the complete distraction of national funding, being distracted away from buying Rafales and buying S-400s and things like that, was completely out of the scenario. So in other words, we have to realize for India what it is. And no matter how much, whether you're left-leaning, whether you're right-leaning, whether you're humanist, whether you're realist, for the next 50 years to come, India funding universal healthcare from a totally government funding resources is simply out of the question. And that fairy tale will never ever materialize.
If indeed we are looking at a healthcare delivery system that is to be paid for by the citizen, then it is a very significant departure from everything that we have learnt about public health policy and practice in India. Now, the new health policy talks about provisioning of services, and it talks about the fact that, as I said, the private sector will provide services. Now, the private sector is not going to provide services free of cost. Private sector services will necessarily be paid for. There are many people in our country who can afford to pay for healthcare, but there are many more who can't. And that is something we need to be careful about.
This India of today, to provide for education, health, housing, etc., will have to draw in the resources which is outside of the government domain. And that is the prevailing reality of today. That's no crime, that is a fact. 30% of India's healthcare, everything put together, is a governmental contribution. 70%, whether it is capital expenses, whether it is hospitals, whether it is pharmaceuticals, is provided by private infrastructure and private spending, out-of-pocket spending.
In fact, the Niti Aayog says privatize more and don't regulate at all. Let the market fix it. That doesn't work in health. It just doesn't work. So these economists who come with, some idea that government is bad, government should disappear, everything should be left to private enterprise, don't understand the dynamics of health.
If you look back on the recommendations of 2019 committee of Niti Aayog, there was a committee called the High Power or whatever it was called, the High Level Group deciding on healthcare. I won't go into the structure of the group, etc. It was a bit lopsided. But V.K. Paul, speaking on behalf of Niti Aayog, I'm ever so happy. For once, a doctor out of All India Institute had in its spine and courage of conviction to come out and say that future of healthcare in India lies in private-public partnership. So for once after 73 years, we are trying to come out of the ambiguity.
Another key area of serious concern is the medical education. Unless the doctors themselves are taught well, unless they learn, can they treat patients? Have some medical colleges become money-spinning rackets?
Today, there are more private medical colleges than government medical colleges. The government medical colleges, so I was one, at least most students had to be somewhat meritorious, compete for admission from middle class families because the tuition was less. So what has happened now? You pay money, get an MBBS degree.
And the private sector invested money because they saw real returns for very little investment, because they didn't really have to show actual library, they didn't have to invest on getting top-notch faculty, because everything could be managed. They didn't have to really run a real hospital. You had fake patients brought in on the day of inspection, because the MCI did not implement its regulations. With very little investment, they were getting a huge return by way of capitation fees.
Video started doing the rounds in social media. It is still available in social media, in which a former judge at the Orissa High Court, his name is Ishraq Masroor Quddussi, was seen debating with some clients on how much bribe he should be paid if he helped the clients, which is Prasad Foundation, which runs a medical institute in Lucknow, to remove the ban quickly. What Quddussi said that he would be using his connections within the judiciary to influence the judiciary and see that the case that the Prasad Foundation has filed is moved through fast and the ban is lifted. Quddussi was arrested. Quddussi was arrested by the CBI, he was jailed, and the case is going on. This is probably will end in another bad deal. But that was not the end. 2 years later, the CBI raided the house of a sitting Allahabad High Court judge. I cannot name him because he still holds his job, and that he has also contested the case. So the sitting Allahabad High Court judge was named in the FIR, and the FIR can be seen on any website. And he was arrested and questioned by the CBI on the same case of taking bribes. So what happens is, Quddussi and this particular judge were in cahoots in trying to remove the ban from the Prasad. Prasad was one of 46 such institutions banned by the government for not even having the basic infrastructure to teach a medical student. Not even the basic infrastructure.
You pay 1 crore, 1.5 crores, capitation fee, whatever name it is, bribe. It's plain and simple bribe to the substandard medical colleges. The colleges should not get even license to teach. So this has all happened under the regulation of MCI. What is MCI? MCI is the highest authority in India to control medical education.
The Medical Council of India has a very significant role to play in this whole process. And Medical Council was set up in 1956. And if you look at the history, there was no real issue with the MCI till the early 90s, when it was opened up to the private sector.
Most of them don't have the required faculty. Most of them have faculty on loan. Their students are allowed to come in on extraordinarily low NEET scores. The scores can be lowered for them, so that it has been pointed out that some people who have scored 0 in some papers could also get into the seat. If they are lowered, management quotas roll it even further. So at some point, both in the intake and in the process and in the output, private colleges are very, very weak.
And the whole, the MCI's job of oversight, regulation, approval, disapproval of courses, hitherto this was only happening with relation to government colleges. And suddenly when all these processes began to be applied to private colleges, it became an opportunity for rent seeking, and then we saw what we have seen in the history of the Medical Council over the 1990s and the 2000s. Various shocking events happened, and the president of the council, for many years, on orders of the court, he was suspended. There was a
He was caught red-handed.
that was in 2010, but between 2002 and 2009, he was also suspended.
I agree that the controlling body of doctors in this country is in a miserable state itself. Though I will remind you that the current controlling body is not the MCI, but it's new avatar, which has doctors as a minority in that group. It is like saying you'll have a bar council where you will be, which will be run by bureaucrats and doctors, and there will be one lawyer in that bar council. That's what we're really the reality about the replacement of medical council in India.
We could have regulated them at least effectively to ensure that, yes, okay, you're a private college, but that doesn't mean that you can take license and liberties with quality of education.
MD, same thing. Private medical colleges, you can get MD by paying, say, 1 crore.
The Parliamentary Standing Committee gives such a scathing report. I mean, I have never seen any Parliamentary Standing Committee report which have been so scathing about a regulator as this one.
It so happens that a reasonable number of seats get filled by students who necessarily do not have the caliber, but parents can afford. And in that case, a private medical college might give you an admission. Now, understand this. If you have to get into a government medical college, the All India cutoff last year was 575 marks out of 620.
I believe that medical colleges, if you give the medical degree at 1 lakh rupees, 50,000, I mean, instead of putting people, then you get merit students. And they're an asset, whether they're working in a government hospital or they're working in a private hospital. They don't have this inner tension. I have to make money to recoup my savings, the expenditures. That tension is not there.
If you want to get into a private medical college, the definition is you need to be NEET qualified, and NEET qualification happens at 20% of the 720 marks. Last year, the cutoff to get into a private medical college was only 120 marks.
Now the doctors who are coming out, present generation, from paying a 5 crores and then becoming a doctor, he has a financial burden, and definitely he wants to make that money out of it. So he is using all the tools that is available to him to make that money.
An English doctor wrote an article in Lancet where he said the corruption in India is so bad that time has come when the 5 English-speaking countries, Australia, UK, Canada, America and all, should not allow Indian doctors to come in anymore. They should be banned unless they go through a very rigorous process.
The regulator failed to regulate effectively. The regulator failed to maintain. More importantly, you see, the regulator also failed to maintain standards.
In 1993, we brought in an amendment of the MCI Act whereby the Medical Council of India had to take prior permission of the government, which in this case is the minister, to sanction a college or enhance the student strength or introduce a new course of instruction. Now, this is where the nexus really started between the political ruling system and the regulator.
One more clause was added in 1993 that you require both the MCI and the minister to give permission to the private medical colleges. So what happened was that the private medical colleges, instead of having to pay 1 bribe, now has to pay 2 bribes. And because of the 1 bribe increasing to 2 bribes, the capitation fee increased, etc., etc. And very sad to say, one of the ex-Supreme Court Chief Justices, who comes from my city, betrayed the whole profession and gave a carte blanche to private healthcare to loot and plunder for 3 years. And it was only when Justice Chandrachud I think somewhere in 2016 or 2017, reversed that decision of Supreme Court and said, fair enough, you can charge a fee, but that fee has to be transparent, it has to be accounted for, that some sobriety was restored in the profession.
The government is formed by us who vote for it, by vested interests who have a very, let us say, keen interest in making sure that what they want gets done. So obviously the government is under the influence of these.
If I were to say that we must privatize much more, we must hand over everything to the corporate sector, I will be a hero. I'll get all those awards and I'll get all the health awards by every CII function. And I'll be lauded and I'll get a Padma Bhushan and so on.
It should be a primary public sector participation.
Wants to set it up, or he is my, I'll set up the medical college on your name because you're sitting at home and you're raking in money through the capitation fees for no effort. Otherwise, in other places, you have to make the same money. How much of gadbad you have to do? Now, how long does it take for me to sign a letter saying, please admit Abhijit, give his son admission, and you pay me 50 lakhs. So I do 2 letters, I get 1 crore for nothing.
It's happening today also. It's crores only. Whether on the overt or covert, it's happening even today.
Medical Council in any country also has a responsibility towards curriculum, standards, teaching, pedagogy, issues of this nature, all of which have suffered greatly in the last 2 decades. In my opinion, there is a very great need for the entire MBBS curriculum and syllabus to be revised, not by people like myself who have a government background, but by professional medical people and medical educators. That really needs to be done, but that has not happened in a very long while. And the other area where we've seen very poor regulation is that in the postgraduate area, where it is an open secret that some disciplines are regarded as more lucrative than others. Radiology being one of them, obs and gynae being one of them. And so the whole focus has been on a huge increase in the number of seats in those sectors, with almost no attention being given to essential public health disciplines such as family medicine, geriatric care, palliative care, community medicine, which have all become the neglected postgraduate specializations.
In case of government medical colleges, there are a lot of medical colleges in India, government medical colleges. The quality is so poor in terms of the quality of teaching and the quality of faculty they are able to afford. If you give a ECG sheet to a fourth year government medical college student, if it doesn't have a marking, he would not be able to put it upright. He might he might actually be looking at it the wrong way.
Unfortunately, we are very orthodox in our sort of an approach. It is time to look at the entire curriculum, be more practical, and be more qualitative local approach. I'll give an example. Tuberculosis, diabetes, thyroid disorders are the commonest problem. The whole management of these should be more stressed rather than something which does not happen in India. Say a certain disease which is rare and it is a US thing. Now, unfortunately, the question papers for postgrad also stresses more on those esoteric rare tests. What is knowing as that you are expressing your exuberant knowledge. The present curriculum in postgraduates, I'm very sorry, it is all MCQ based. Where it is knowledge, it is not practical.
Post graduation. Have you ever heard somebody who did chemical engineering for 3 years was suddenly shifted to mechanical engineering or physics on the 4th year? This is what happens to a doctor. A young mind imagines they want to be a surgeon, they want to be an orthopedician, somebody wants to be a gynecologist. A girl ends up in ENT or doing completely different. Why? Because they are not human beings anymore. They've been reduced to some multiple choice question statistic. We have demotivated them.
We are talking now about medical colleges in the MCI, but This is true about other regulators in the health sector, namely the Nursing Council, for instance. It is true about the regulatory councils in the Ayush sector.
The nexus between the political class and private investors in health is really a serious problem. And here I think all political parties without exception are involved. It's not as if it's only one political party or another political party, everybody.
Once you create a big pothole which is filled with cow dung, then you don't have any ability, right, any chance to regulate that big pothole.
I don't see these so-called experts in healthcare, people who are out to resurrect healthcare in this country. I don't see them wearing PPEs, going out to help the community that is suffering from COVID. In this city, 2 private medical colleges have been taken over by the government and made into COVID hospitals. These same graduates from these private medical colleges that you lambast and discredit so much are donning personal protective equipment. People who have become doctors 2 months ago without any training are being made to wear personal protective equipment and go and help these COVID patients. And they are from private medical colleges just as much as they are from public medical colleges.
People complain of overcharging at hospitals, of excessive fees to doctors, of unnecessary tests and inflated bills. In a developing country with limited funds, to bring in a thorough change will cost our exchequer a huge amount of money. Where exactly is the money?
Let us look at how much money is allocated for each election that takes place, either at the state level or at the central level. Unimaginable quantities of money flow into the system just to run an election, just to bring a government to power. So it is not as though we don't have funds. We use the funds for the wrong reasons. We use the funds to gain power.
So root cause is corruption.
Corruption in the government sector comes in when you allow a government doctor to also do private practice during government hours. Though the rule doesn't say that, but we all know that it is in the mornings. Instead of teaching in the college or working in the OPD, they're mainly doing private practice in their own nursing homes. And so you hear the stories of things going, the patients and everybody being sent off. So that the corruption comes in over there.
But I think this is just the result of a situation where there are a small number of doctors with a highly in-demand skill, and there are vast numbers of people who need their services. I hope a completely unequal supply and demand situation.
So, it is a question of supply and demand. In the public sector, we hardly have doctors. Unbelievably, it is 1 per 11,000. How much time can a doctor give to a patient? Some doctors are overworked and some just don't attend to their duties.
Yes, that is the thing to note, right? Only one government doctor for such a large number of people. That's the average figure. But in reality, of course, most of these people do not even have a doctor, right? You're just averaging it out. Okay? Many of these people live in distant villages and they don't get to see a doctor at all.
Dr. Malhotra, it's so difficult to get you. Half the time you're in Antarctica, sometimes in the South Pole, and I'm told that you have even carried out an operation at the Antarctica, at Maitrey. How do you do it? Do you have such facility there?
Yes, your information is correct that we did an operation, an appendectomy operation in Antarctica at Maitri
station. Dr. Malhotra, you have been in the government service and at the helm for many years. With the ratio of doctor to patient being 1:11,000, how do you manage to treat a patient?
It has been very difficult. It has been very difficult from the very early stages of my medical career. When there was a time when in a one single day, I had to see about 120 patients in 6 hours time.
With 2 to 3 minutes per patient, it becomes a strenuous mechanical process, tiring and boring. Then aberrations creep in, initially covert, then overt.
I have known in my time in government, it used to be a constant problem in the state government that government doctors were actually spending more of their time in their own clinics or were diverting patients from the hospital to their private clinics and then charging them. But because they were in the event actually providing a service, a lot of people were paying money, their interest only was in getting well. And now, how does one change human nature? I don't know.
There are the incentives for making money through the quick kickback culture that has come in.
The rule says that a doctor who is drawing a non-practicing allowance should not be practicing. But in our country, what is happening is that almost 70% or maybe more of doctors who are drawing non-practicing allowance are also practicing.
I understand that UP government has recently, the Chief Minister has said that government doctors must not do private practice. Now it is a very revolutionary order. I don't know whether he'll be able to implement it.
There are serious concerns about a nexus between doctors and diagnostic clinics.
There is a nexus between these diagnostic laboratories and doctors because they will refer you for an MRI when no MRI needed. Then out of 8,000 he gets a kickback, which is called commission.
This cut money to the doctor is prevalent. What is the percentage is what I don't sort of know. Most of the labs like us who do not give cut money anything, but we are also surviving and thriving.
আরএমপি ডক্টর যাদের জাস্ট রেজিস্টার্ড মেডিকেল প্র্যাকটিস তাদের কোনো ডিগ্রি নেই বা আজকে কোয়াক ডক্টর অবভিয়াসলি তারা ডিপেন্ড হচ্ছে কাট মানির উপরে
The diagnostic centers that have come up all around, they have a kickback culture that how do diagnostic centers develop their market? They go to a provider and tell him that, you send me your patients, I'll give you a commission. And so this, once this starts, once a doctor begins to see 200 rupees kicking in for no real effort in the evenings, only because he referred some 5 patients to a particular, that becomes 5, becomes 10, becomes 20. And the incentive to want to send a patient for a diagnostic, even if it's not required.
And of course there are doctors who will say, this is a good area for me to make money. And I have a tie-up with the lab or tie-up with hospital, God knows what.
Again, you have to understand the private sector is not a homogeneous unit. And when we in health discourse talk about private sector, we mean the Jhola Bengali Babu who is sitting in a corner of a pharmacy shop and prescribing drugs, to the Polos and the Maxes and the Fortises and the big corporate sector. So, but they are not a homogeneous lot. Sometimes the Jhola Bengali Babu may be doing a much more service in providing low-cost treatment for minor ailments, which the same thing if you went to a corporate hospital would cost you infinitely excessive amount of the large amount of diagnostics that make you go through for a very simple minor ailment.
My colleagues, I graduate, they are practicing, they have become corrupt also. They are involved in commissions.
Unfortunately, this is now becoming a norms and a right for many in the profession, not the larger segment. But there are many in the profession who consider that getting And they're coining this as interesting terminologies like service charges. There are many other charges which would sound ridiculous, entertaining at some point. The thieves also have got their own philosophy, their own perceived sense of greatness of theft. So it's theft only.
Are our diagnostic clinics mere business centers? And how reliable are the diagnostic laboratories?
বলতে পারেন আজকে প্যাথোলজিক্যাল ল্যাব ইজ এ বিজনেস, বাট এখানে সবসময় আমাদের মাথায় রাখতে হবে এটা একটা অর্গানাইজেশন সোশ্যালি, বিকজ কি আমরা মানুষের যে টেস্ট, আমাদের যে টেস্টের উপরে তার আজকে একটা জীবনটা পুরো ডিপেন্ড করে।
Many of the labs peripherally or in the outside of the city, which you don't come to your ambit, is being run by technicians where the doctors are not present to sign. This is perhaps a point that is the pain for the whole quality, and they should not be allowed. Forget about NABL. See, there are accreditation bodies. NABL would be a quality, but the government, local government everywhere has the licensing thing. See, and they have the vigilance power to see the consultant and the supervisory thing. So that is also to be implemented by the local government.
10টা প্যারামিটার যেখানে আছে সেখানে একটা প্যারামিটারকে টেস্ট করে তার বেসের উপরে হয়তো তারা রিপোর্ট লিখে দেয়, কিন্তু এটা ওই জায়গাটাই সম্ভব আছে যেখানে হয়তো 70%, 80% যেখানে কমিশন যায় বা নেয়।
And this is where you find the tension that needs to be addressed very quickly by public policy.
আমার কোনো টেকনিক্যাল ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড নেই বা আমার কোনো টেকনিক্যাল এক্সপিরিয়েন্স ছিল না, তো আমি টেকনিক্যাল এক্সপিরিয়েন্সের জন্য আই হ্যাভ ব্রট ওয়ান পার্সন ফ্রম এ রিনাউন্ড হসপিটাল কি আপনি ল্যাবটাকে চালান। কিছুদিন দেখার পরে আমি দেখা যাচ্ছে লোকটা কোনো টেস্ট করছে না, জাস্ট রিপোর্ট দিয়ে যায়। তখন আমি জিজ্ঞেস করলাম কি ব্যাপার, এটা কেন হয় এরকম? বলছে না না এরকমই করা হয়, এটা জাস্ট দেখে নেওয়া হবে, তাতেই বুঝে যাচ্ছে কি পেশেন্ট হাই আছে লো আছে। সেদিন থেকে লোকটাকে ইমিডিয়েট আমি স্যাক করলাম।
How many of the government labs are NABL accredited? How many of the government labs?
Why not?
Huh?
Why not?
That's what the mentality of the government is saying, that they are not. But they feel that they are the quality. They are the torchbearers of quality, which they have not got that stamp. You take central government, you take West Bengal government. How many of the government labs have got that accreditation? Hardly any.
What I'm trying to say is that the incentive structures in our health system are so that there is a direct conflict of interest between a provider of services and the patient's welfare.
So, after the tests, the doctors prescribe medicine. Are those medicines effective? Do they actually work?
The industry says 85% of the drug supply in this country is not proven. We don't know whether it works or not. The first thing doctors do when they graduate is they take something called a Hippocratic Oath that basically says, do no harm. Whatever you do, the first order of thing the doctor does is do no harm. Now, if you're true to your education, if you're true to your profession, and you say that I do no harm, how the hell are you going to prescribe something that you know has no evidence of actually working? How do you reconcile those two things?
Well, this is actually a very, very huge issue and really relates to another regulator, namely the Drug Controller General of India, the DCGI and his establishment, that has the authority to approve the use of medicinal preparations. So the same sorts of issues that came up with the Medical Council come up in the case of the DCGI also.
Remember, corruption in medicine is not a doctor's doing. A doctor is a mere cog on the wheel because the system of corruption is exploited by far bigger people who are standing behind the screen.
the 53rd Parliamentary Standing Committee report that looked at how the CDSCO approves drugs, it actually pointed out letters that were written by doctors in support of approval of certain drugs. And it actually, reproduced those letters in the report. And it said, letters from apparently 5 different doctors spread across the country, one in Mumbai, one in Chennai, one in Hyderabad. They wrote exactly the same thing, exactly the same language. And it was written on the hospital or the clinic letterhead. Now, how is it possible? Maybe it's possible that 2 people can write exactly the same words, but how is it possible that all 5 of them, and more importantly, why doesn't the regulator who actually received those letters, read those letters, and gave approval to these drugs, why wasn't the regulator questioning these things? Is it not apparent when you look at 5 letters and they say exactly the same thing?
How come 85% of our untested drugs go to patients? Aren't our leaders aware of the malpractices?
What we have today, 85% of our drug supply is unproven, didn't happen overnight. Everybody knew about it. Ranjit Roy Chaudhary committee knew about it. Katoj committee knew about it. Hathi committee knew about it. I'm going back 10 years right now. You can go back 30 years. There are good recommendations that have been made to the health ministry. None of those have been implemented. Now you tell me, is that intentional?
Is it true that there is a markup of 1000% on the medicines we buy?
Possible, possible. Again, it is a function of the market. If you've got a monopoly,
I've not studied the problem to say whether it's 1000%, but certainly branded generic drugs are definitely more expensive than generic drugs. And India is probably the only country which has branded generic and patented drugs. Other countries all have generic and patented, Canada, UK, and so on. But we have this another layer called branded generic. So the point is, the branded generic are those typical companies, pharma companies, manufacturers, who invested a huge amount of money in building their brand, the market brand. So obviously the costs that go into the investment that goes into building that brand is then piled on to the basic cost of the generic drug. So it's definitely much more expensive. Now whether it's 1,000 times more or 500 times more, I wouldn't be able to say.
Right after we went to the Supreme Court with our public interest litigation, the day after that, our court date, the government banned 343 what are called fixed dose combinations. These are multiple drugs formulated together, right? And with the expectation that you get better patient compliance. Many of these kind of cocktails are not available anywhere else in the world. It's only in India we do this. And there is nothing wrong with preparing a cocktail. The trouble is that whenever you create a new drug, which is when you're adding 2 or 3 drugs, you have to clinically prove that they actually work.
I'm sorry today, Saraswati is at the gates of Lakshmi and not otherwise. Income generation is the most important point. And the pharmaceutical industry, again, as I said, is no saint. It's an industry.
So what about quality control and quality assessment?
CAG says between 15 and 31% of drugs that our government procures for government use through central government health scheme are substandard. Don't take my word for it, read the CAG report. If you can bribe the project director to give you the order, a pharma company which needs the order may also do it. It depends upon the values of the company, and it depends upon the competition, it depends upon the market for the drug, whatever it is. But I do agree that there are practices in the pharma industry which may be more widespread than the others, and which are not, let's say, which are not really moral. There is a CAG report from Armed Forces Procurement that said that between 15 and 31% of the drugs that are sold in armed forces to our army and to our navy and to our air force are substandard. I'm not saying this. This is the CAG that says that.
You have no regulations. You don't, even if the few regulations you have very weak enforcement systems. Now that I would say is a deliberate neglect.
There are health and medical schemes that ought to help, but in reality, what is the scenario?
There are so many schemes all around. Ayushman Bharat has been added as another scheme. This is perhaps an insurance-based scheme, and I don't think we have sufficient number of beds in any way in India so that we can accommodate all the poor people.
We've had a lot of health schemes. We had 23,000 crores allocated to Ayushman Bharat. Did it make a little impact on out-of-pocket payment? It did not. Why did it not? Because 60% of out-of-pocket payment is spent on medicines, pharmaceuticals, not on operations. So if 60% of spending comes on buying medicines from medicine store, n number of Ayushman Bharats will be required to make even a 2% impact on the very compelling out-of-pocket payments that our population has to go through. So why is the policies, etc., in Indian healthcare today lopsided? You exist in the real world. Do you know of any company where a 30% stakeholder pretends to be the lord and master of all he surveys? You cannot in the real world. So to navigate Indian healthcare, okay, we welcome, there should be a Ministry of Health. It is a radical suggestion, but the realistic suggestion is Indian healthcare has to be managed by a joint committee which has potent, substantial representation from private healthcare, along with the governmental, and it is that joint decision-making empowered body that has to give direction to Indian healthcare in the future.
Insurance is a promissory note kind of a thing to tell you that if you fall sick, you will not have to pay out of your pocket, you will get services. But that is possible only if the service provider is there. Otherwise, what does that voucher mean to you if you have to walk 10 miles away and then go and find a hospital somewhere when you're having a heart attack in the middle of the night? It doesn't mean anything at all.
Ayushman Bharat is a wonderful program, but 90% of Ayushman Bharat is costed below, the tariff is below cost. What does the government of India want? Does government of India want the entire healthcare sector to be a grounded Air India all over again? Is it possible? Is it realistic? It is not. But rather than being, acidic and vitriolic all the time, I, being a doctor, do appreciate the fact that the government of India, after 73 long years, have got the courage of conviction to spell out what is hard reality and hard facts. And the hard fact is, it will remain a joint sector enterprise. There is no way the Indian economy, even if you become a $5 trillion economy, your demands will increase on the other side. So let us call spade a spade. Let us forget the kind of, the left liberal mythology of a completely government funded healthcare. If you want completely government funded healthcare, direct and indirect taxation has got to increase by 40%. You try increasing direct and indirect taxation by 40%, the government who launches this proposal will evaporate like camphor in 15 minutes' time.
The poor people who live, who migrate for work, who live in forests, who live in tribal, mainly the tribal areas, or a large part of northern India, for example, there's neither public nor private sector. I would say that with confidence, at least that's a condition in about 250 districts of this country, which may be accounting for at least 30 to 40% of our population. There is no semblance of public or private sector. There will only be single quacks who are operating around.
According to news, we have, like a miracle, come up to WHO standards. Isn't it really remarkable?
If we try in some way to quantify the effective healthcare administration, which means somebody giving a solution for a stomach ache, for a diarrhea, for a earache, for a fever, anywhere which is outside of the city, about 15 minutes thereafter, or a little bit more, healthcare is already in those outposts of India. About 70% of healthcare is administered by the non-formal trained quacks anyway. They are not to be disrespected. They are not to be trivialized. But we owe them a large debt of credit that there is some healthcare, may not be through a degree, a diploma or a certificate, reaching those people by any means. This has been an insoluble problem because the government has repeatedly tried to push young graduates into sort of, like Livingstone discovering Africa, to the most inhabitable, inhospitable places on the planet. And the first few days, a young doctor ends up cleaning termite and fighting with snakes.
We have come up to the mark, but that was done by juggling the statistics and by adding almost 7 lakh plus doctors of different uh, systems like Ayurveda, Unani, Siddha, homeopathy, naturopathy, and so that sort of doctors, yes, they are treating somewhere on their own, but they are not sufficiently trained enough always.
The quacks will not disappear overnight. In the meantime, we can hold their hands so that they are some ways integrated and they are able to give more credible service. Similarly, for the lakhs and lakhs of Ayush practitioners, I see that there is a lot of sense of adversarial relationship between the doctors on one hand and the Ayush practitioners on the other. I think it is extremely wrong to get engaged in the fight. Let them take up maybe postings in basic facilities, primary health center, where the government is finding it difficult to post a regular doctor. If a doctor cannot or will not accept postings in those places and an Ayush doctor can, there is no harm in posting them. But the government will also be very disingenuous and very deceitful if they try to duplicate, to supersede, to replicate the work of a regular MBBS qualified graduate or postgraduate on the sly by introducing Ayush doctors in parallel postings and competitive postings. Now that will be a very sinful thing to do.
The politicians must surely be aware. Why then such a situation?
You are right when you say that people in the political system are aware of what is happening. If you were to listen to discussions in Parliament on this subject, for instance, many MPs will speak with great information and authority on what exactly is going wrong. I remember such debates myself from the time when I was in government. So certainly, yes, people from the political setup know fully well what is happening.
I would be very happy if the politicians of the country believe and understands that health is a political matter.
Now, why are they not doing anything about it? It's a much more difficult question.
In the manifesto, the elaborate plans are laid out about health, but no one is doing the costing of what it would mean if you really were to sincerely implement all those commitments that you made in the manifestos. then you would need something like 5% GDP of public investment. That's not coming. And for the last 70 years, our public investment has been between the region of 0.9 to 1.1.
We have criticized, I think, previous speakers. I've seen some of the wonderful interviews who have taken the lack of healthcare spending to shreds, 1.2% of GDP. And I don't want to recite all the statistics to you, 1900 rupees per capita income, which cannot even buy a decent meal for two in a McDonald's. That is the kind of spending we do on ourselves every year. Fair enough. But remember, in one way or the other, this country is compelled to spend 4.6 lakh crores on defense. This country has got tremendous distractions as far as the unfavorable geopolitics is concerned.
So, what are we talking about? Even today, the latest national policy says 2.5 in 2025. By that time, the prices, the costs and everything would have gone up so much more, the demand for services and so on, that we might need 3.5% of GDP to get basic services. So I don't think politicians are really very serious. We are not serious about health as yet.
We change the system. It's no use pointing a finger at somebody else and saying, oh, the politician, the bureaucrat, the businessman. We who form the silent majority, if we are not going to get up and say enough is enough, these things will continue.
One aspect of a country's healthcare facility is to trace, follow, and suggest the way forward in case of any pandemic. What is a real situation?
So India had that, the integrated disease surveillance program, and technically still has it. Systems requires 1.5 lakh health workers in our sub-centers to report weekly on events of importance, on population-based indicators. 50,000 healthcare facilities of the public system and any number from the private system that has to report clinically, both on notifiable disease and on a list of diseases that will keep surveillance, and from at that point of time, 168 laboratories, which will confirm the diagnosis. And whenever there is an outbreak, whenever there is an unusual increase at any level, a response has to be organized by a joint investigation team. These weekly reports go on till February 2000 first week, when the first 3 COVID-19 cases in India, all 3 from Kerala, are reported very faithfully. And I must say, as a professional, I liked the report and how well it had been written up. But mysteriously, it stopped functioning immediately after.
So, is there any model available today in the whole world that we can follow and perhaps which can help us map the way forward?
Indian healthcare has to accept reality. There is simply no way you are going to give healthcare either in terms of money, infrastructure, trained manpower, unless you recognize the existence, you respect the existence of the private healthcare for all they do. Question comes, is there such a model in the world? Of course there is. Who is the only one country who fought and stood up to the corona crisis simply on the strength of its healthcare? The only technocrat that leads the Western world today, Angela Merkel, leading Germany. It has 3 times the bed per capita population as United States. It has 5 times the beds per capita population of Italy. And why and how did Germany do so? Do you realize? Germany is a universal healthcare system, government controlled, government regulated, but not one hospital in Germany is a government hospital. Each and every hospital in Germany is a private sector unit who sits together with the government. They decide on their own what are the viable levels, at what level every procedure will be charged, bed charges, hospitalization charges, medical charges. And 80% of people have private insurance, 20 to 25% have government sponsored insurance for people who are probably not well off. So government is like the referee. Government is like the symphony orchestra. Government is like regulating, moderating, ironing out the creases in healthcare. Even Germany cannot decide, cannot afford a government-funded healthcare. What are the Asian examples? South Korea. South Korea the Asia's pinnacle of healthcare success, even with the coronavirus, does not have a single government hospital. They are either private trusts, industry managed, or private sector enterprises. It's very similar to the German model. What does the government do? The government puts all the heads together, does a financial recce of the healthcare system, and says not what is ideal or what is sort of unrealistic, but lays down the practical guidelines. The great systems we knew of, National Health Service, United Kingdom, cannot afford government spending today. They are fracturing and fragmenting. So whether it is back to front or front to back, NHS will end up getting privatized. So there is no point being secretive about it. We have to be realistic. And we are happy to say for once that Government of India has recognized that reality.
So what happens to us? You, me, and our families? What? Where, how is healthcare in our country?
Struggling.
I would say it's stumbling, mumbling.
What happens to a doctor, irrespective of where he's trained? He has two options in this country. He can either join a private sector hospital, i.e. mainly a corporate hospital, or join a government hospital. If he joins a government hospital, he has to cater to the requirements of his political bosses, i.e. the bureaucrats and the politicians who are in power at that time. If he joins a corporate hospital, he is dictated by the whims and fancies of a businessman who is out there to make money, who regards doctors in the same way as he regards security staff in this hospital. Unnecessary, but unfortunately have to be present to run the hospital. This is the problem. We are making it most unattractive for young people to want to become doctors. And we will pay the price of this 15 and 20 years later.
All improvement in the world has come up by a group of small dedicated individuals. And what we need in Bengal and in India, why take only Bengal, is a group of such people to get together and say enough is enough.
Healthcare is only getting some hospitals which glares and give some dividends, some care to the politicians and their relatives in their times of needs.
India has to recognize reality as far as healthcare delivery is concerned. The medical manpower that is being produced today has to be in ratio with the infrastructure. We are not at all concerned about some inert population statistic which has no relevance to the practice of medicine. And in whichever way you can, we want ethics, we want merit, we want the passion, we want the sincerity to be restored back in medicine.
I think as a country, we first need to figure out which one do we want to be. Do we want to be on the side where we go to mandir and pray every day that, Bhagwan theek kar do? Or do we want to be on the side where we prove that our medicines actually work?
India's healthcare, unfortunately, is becoming a carbuncle. You need to have a boil so that you can treat it well. You can treat one phase, but when you deal with a carbuncle, you are really frightened.
When I was in school, out of the top 10 students of every school in this city, there were at least 3 who aspired to be a doctor. Today, there is not a single student in the top 10 of any school in this city that aspires to get into medicine. So forget about private and public medicine. The biggest problem of medical education, and this is caused by people who taint the profession and think about everybody as bad, do not think even a moment to respect the sacrifice that this profession is currently making all over the world, including in this country, this state, and this city, for victims of this pandemic. It is because of this that we are no longer going to attract any sensible young person into this profession.
This whole thing of corruption and the political nexus is very, very strong, and it's very difficult to break it unless some dictatorial spirit comes in, who's really committed.
Doctors can never be produced as a ratio of population. Underline it 50 times. Go and say that to every committee you meet on the face of the planet. Doctors today in civilized society has to be produced on the ratio of infrastructure. When a young person picks up a seat and is compelled to, fresh MBBS, what is the chap doing? Some dingy little medicine store with a 50-watt bulb at the top, practicing medicine. Had he been an engineer, you would have called him unemployed. Because he's a doctor, you'll call him private practice. Feel guilty for the fact that less than 15% of India's 9 lakh doctors are in any kind of standard employment. Most of them are worse than your home healths. They are earning from day to day. If a doctor falls sick in private practice for 5 days, there is no earning from the family. And you say, we are the noblest profession in the world? God bless this nobility.